I realize I did not introduce myself, so I'll do that as well. My name is Sandy de la Torre. I'm the DSF Events Manager, and just really excited to have you all here joining us as we all strengthen our FAFSA knowledge. With that, we're just going to continue admitting folks as they come, but I just want to pass it on to my colleague Diana, who will officially get us started for the day.
Awesome. Good morning, everyone. My name is Diana Madriz. I'm the Assistant Director of College Access at DSF. And along with my colleagues, we'll be spending some time this morning diving a little bit more into some complicated FAFSA situations. So some things we want to start off with, like Cindy said, we're going to be using the Q&A feature. So want to make sure that you're writing down your questions, but you're putting it in the Q&A, not in the comment section. We'll be answering those at the end of today's session. So we will not be answering questions throughout the presentation, but until the end. So today's session focuses mostly on scenarios. We'll be using breakout rooms for discussion so that you're able to learn from each other and review as a group. If we don't address your question, please know that there are other trainings that are coming, or we'll be sending up follow-up information. So don't worry, you're all muted. But like Cindy said, if you can keep your cameras off, that minimizes distractions. And in case you join a little later, we are recording this, and we're also going to be sending out follow-up slides. So I'll pass it over to Dante.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dante Bills. I'm the Assistant Director of College Access. Today, the team that is going to be diving into this deeper dive FAFSA training includes Shannon Weber, who is the Director of Financial Aid at Red Rocks Community College. Diana, who just introduced herself, she is the Assistant Director of College Access. Cindy De La Torre, who is their Events Manager, and Natasha Garfield, who is our Director of Scholarships. So by the end of this training, our hope is that everyone will be able to identify what questions to ask students and families when they're doing the FAFSA. Also, we hope for everyone to gain some new tools to help families analyze different situations when completing the FAFSA. As Diana detailed, a lot of this knowledge will be gained through doing some small group discussions and breakout groups to go over commonly occurring scenarios that happen when doing the FAFSA. Some key changes to the 24-25 FAFSA include each contributor must have their own studentaid.gov account. This was previously known as the FSA ID, now known as the studentaid.gov account. Consent and approval for the transfer of federal tax information is required from all contributors. Step parents or student spouse may need to participate as a contributor. Federal tax information will be transferred directly from the IRS, and the parent contributor is the parent who provides the most financial support. And these are things that we'll go over a lot of times as we wait for the final release of the FAFSA. So we have 8 scenarios in total, but for the first 3 scenarios, myself or Diana will read the scenario out aloud for everyone and give you some time to think. And then we invite up to 3 volunteers to raise their hand using the Zoom feature of raising your hand. And then Diana will call on you and ask you to unmute yourself, and you'll have 1 minute to respond to that question. It's very important that we stick to answering the question that is asked in the scenario and not add any what ifs or clarifying questions, just for time constraints. If you do have any additional questions, please add those to the Q&A, and we'll go over those at the end of the session. And then once our 3 volunteers complete, Shannon will then go over what the answer to the scenario is. All right, handing it back over to Diana.
All right, so we're moving through and we're ready for our first scenario. So a student comes to see you because they've heard that there's a new FAFSA and they want to be prepared. They're ready for their 3rd year of college, so they feel comfortable with the previous version. They say they've heard they don't need to worry about having their tax return with them to do the 24-25 FAFSA. but they want to know whether that's true. So the two questions are, how do you advise this student? And explain your reasoning for recommending that they do or do not need their tax return. So gonna look for those hands for 3 volunteers who want to answer. I saw Brennan first.
So I think they don't need to have their return with them, since all the information is delivered by the or from the IRS website. I do have concerns about that, considering how unreliable that process has been in the past, but hopefully that's been fixed.
Thank you, Brennan. I see Holly.
I think we were saying that still stick with best practice and advise everybody to bring their forms, knowing that in the past it has been a little wonky and can be very specific to, is there a period in an address or anything like that to getting the information actually transferred? And so best practice would just be advising them to still bring the information.
Thank you, Holly. We have one more. Any differing opinions? If not, I can hand it over to Shannon to give us the answer.
Thank you, Deanna. So before we even get to the answer to this scenario, one thing that's really critical for us all to know is that all FAFSA contributors must consent and approve the transfer of their federal tax information to the FAFSA. If a contributor, like Dante said, that would be a spouse or a parent, possibly a step-parent, if they don't provide consent and approval, the FAFSA will simply not be processed at all, and the student will not be eligible for federal aid. We'll go over some alternatives to that later, like unsubsidized loans or independent status. But in general, it's always good for folks to have their tax returns available if possible. It's true that the new Direct Data Exchange, or DDX, has replaced the IRS DRT. It's true that it is actually more streamlined. For example, a period in an address on a tax return should no longer cause hiccups in the new process, but there are a few things that having your tax return on hand will help you to verify. Accurately reporting your tax filing status. We'll go over some details about the changes to family size and how that's going to be calculated, but that can also be really helpful. Starting with the 24-25 FAFSA, family size is going to be assumed based on the number of dependents reported on the taxes. So it can be really helpful to know that information as well. And then we list some other aspects that will have to be manually input on the FAFSA: IRA, pension rollovers, earned income tax credit, grants, scholarships reported on your taxes, and the foreign earned income exclusion, which is a verifiable item. Also, if there's ever a change in the marital status, that would also require manual entry on the FAFSA.
Thank you, Shannon. Okay, so for scenario 2, a 12th grader comes to your workshop. They tell you that they came to the US in 2022 on a visitor visa and have been attending a DPS high school since they got here. Their visa is expired and they don't have a social security number. They're excited to graduate high school in May, and they're hoping to attend either CCD or MSU Denver. Which financial aid application should they complete? How did you decide? Based on the information provided, will the student be eligible for in-state tuition and student financial or state financial aid? And then again, use that hand raising option. Go ahead, Cynthia.
Good morning. I would say that the student would be using the CASPA app because they have stated that they do not have a social security number. And I decided because of that reason. I would also say that based on the information that they provided, they would be eligible for asset money that would be available to them.
Thank you. Any
Sure.
other volunteers? All right. Okay, I'll pass it on to you, Shannon.
Thanks, Dante. So yes, because the student is neither a US citizen nor an eligible non-citizen, they are not eligible for federal aid and they should not complete the FAFSA. And just like Cynthia said, they should complete the CASFA. Most institutions are looking for a COF affidavit to be on file with the state of Colorado in order to award state financial aid that's available to asset eligible students, and institutions can help with that process also. Because they have been attending DPS for more than a year, leading to high school graduation, they should also be eligible for in-state tuition. As long as they can demonstrate what we call domicile, or that they've been in Colorado for 12 months before they start college. You all are probably familiar with the changes in the asset law that no longer have to be attending a Colorado high school for 3 years before, and then enter college or university in Colorado within 1 year of completing high school. So that's really helpful, that we really only need to show they've been here for 12 months before they start college. Some students who complete a GED in Colorado can also qualify for state financial aid, but they may have some hiccups with the COF affidavit process because they don't have a SACID or that state ID number. Thank you. And
All
just
right.
a reminder, if you do have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A section, especially if they're, or if you want to add to anything, go ahead and put it in the Q&A and we'll get to that toward the end of the session.
Thanks, Shannon. Our third scenario before we break into breakout rooms is student is a US citizen, but parent isn't documented and doesn't have a social security number. The other parent is not in the picture. Parent is paid in cash and doesn't earn enough to file taxes. So your 3 questions are, which application will this student complete, FAFSA or CASFA? What does the family need to know about completing the application? What is likely to happen after the application is submitted? So again, use the raise hand feature. Anyone want to take not a guess? I was going to say stab, but that sounded violent, so. Gabe.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for leading this session. Since the student is a U.S. citizen, they would complete the FAFSA. The application the student submits doesn't depend upon a parent's documentation status. Contrary to past years, the parent should be informed that they will be eligible to create a studentaid.gov account. And there will be an identity verification process that is different than in years past based upon knowledge-based questions that the parent would need to respond to. I'm not sure what would happen after the application is submitted exactly.
Thanks, Gabe. Shannon, I'll hand it off to you.
All right, thanks. So Gabe, you're absolutely right. The student is an eligible citizen. They would complete the FAFSA because that eligibility is based on the student's status and not the parents. And like you said, this is a huge, hopefully helpful change that parents who do not have social security numbers can now create a studentaid.gov account and actually must in order for their dependent students' FAFSA to be processed at all. They would select, I do not have a social security number. The knowledge-based identity verification questions, a lot of people have concerns around that. They are developed by TransUnion, which is a credit agency, but they've changed the methodology of those questions. So a person does not have to have a credit history in order to be able to answer the knowledge-based questions. At least that's what we've been assured. If they do have trouble with that, they'll be directed to call 1-800-4FED-AID, or the actual numbers are here on the slide. And then the help desk at Federal Student Aid will send an email to the parent with instructions about how to verify their identity. So if they have any trouble with that process, of course, they can complete a paper FAFSA. No longer will parents be printing a signature page and mailing that to Federal Student Aid. Instead, the parent and the student would both complete the paper FAFSA together and mail that to FSA. Now, we understand there may be some instances where an ITIN is requested. My understanding is that the only time, if an ITIN will be used at all, will be to complete the IRS direct data exchange, the DDX, and the ITIN should never be used to create the studentaid.gov account, or what we have previously known as the FSA ID. Let's see, it could take up to 3 days if they are unable to verify their identity through the identity verification questions. It could take some time to have their studentaid.gov account verified and ready to be used. But for those folks who are able to go through the identity verification questions successfully, they will immediately have a studentaid.gov account that's verified, and that waiting period will no longer apply. Now, in response to the question, did or will the parent file a 2022 IRS Form 1040 or 1040 NR? The parent will select no. And we haven't gotten any real clear information about what will happen after they select no. But we do expect that the parent will have an option describing why they didn't file a tax return. And so we will send out more information as we get clarification on that specific process. Also, a lot of this is pretty exciting stuff. This Pell lookup table, which will be sent to you as part of the resources, I believe. For those of you who've worked with financial aid in the past, I feel like anytime someone would ask what seemed like a really simple question, like how much money do I have to make in order for my student to qualify for a federal Pell Grant? We used to just kind of have to say, oh gosh, the calculation, the equation is 13 pages long. We can't give any clear information. And what's really exciting is we actually can, in many cases, let a family know what to expect based on their AGI and their family size. Now, family size, again, on the FAFSA is now going to be assumed based on how many dependents are filed on the taxes. And we'll go over an option to update that. But here's a layout here. There's no longer going to be an expected family contribution or an EFC. Instead, we're going to have an SAI, or a student aid index. And that's really going back to the original intent of really just showing where someone's need is. In the past, someone could have a FAFSA that gave them a certain EFC, and we could say, well, based on your EFC, this is the amount of your Pell Grant. And that is no longer going to be the case. Someone could have an SAI anywhere on the range from -1,500 up and still possibly qualify for a Pell Grant based on these guidelines and some other questions that they answer on the FAFSA. So take a look at this when you get a chance, save one for yourself. I think this is actually really going to help families feel like they're coming away with a clear understanding of what to expect.
Thank you, Shannon. So next we're going to transition into scenarios 4 through 8. Myself and Deanna will read these off again, and then we'll go into breakout groups where you'll have 5 minutes as a group to discuss each scenario. Once you're in your group, please select someone to kind of like lead the group, and then another person to take some notes for the discussion. Once your 5 minutes are up, we'll come back as a larger group, and Shannon will go over the possible answers of this question. While you're in your breakout group, if any questions pop up, please add those to the Q&A. During this particular session, we won't call on any participants. So please just add your questions to the Q&A. Okay, so scenario 4, undocumented parent concern. The student from our previous scenario went home to talk to their parent about the FAFSA and creating a studentaid.gov account. As a reminder, the parent doesn't have a social security number and the other parent isn't in the picture. The student and parent come in to meet with you. The parent is visibly uncomfortable. When you try to find out what's on their mind, they share that they are feeling worried about sharing their personal details, including their address, phone number, and financial information with the federal government. The questions for this scenario are, what can you say to address their concerns, and what options, if any, do they have if they don't feel comfortable creating a studentaid.gov account and completing the online FAFSA? So now you all should have options to go into breakout rooms. And once those pop up, go ahead and join those. Okay, I think we're all back from the breakout rooms. Thank you everyone for participating in that, and I will hand it over to Shannon.
Thank you. So keep in mind, of course, that this FAFSA statement of consent or approval, it is required for the FAFSA to move anywhere. The schools will not receive a FAFSA if there is no consent from a contributor. However, the FAFSA statement of consent for the parent contributor, it really does ask to provide approval for the FAFSA information to be shared only with the U.S. Department of Treasury or the IRS in order to determine eligibility for an amount of federal student aid. It does also authorize the U.S. Department of Education to share the FAFSA and federal tax information with colleges and universities, state higher ed agencies, and certain scholarship organizations. So again, it's kind of that all or nothing decision there. We will talk about options if we can't move forward, but this does mean that the Department of Education is not authorized to share the information with other government agencies like Homeland Security, ICE, USCIS. However, of course, this might not be enough to really reassure a parent that it is safe to share their information when they create their studentaid.gov account. So of course, if a parent remains worried and doesn't want to create an account or complete the verification of identity process, the FAFSA, then of course we want to give people time to consider their options and understand really, what they're weighing here in terms of their concerns and the result for their student. They may, of course, wish to consult with an immigration attorney, and DSF does have resources, legal resources that they can share. They also have the option to submit a paper FAFSA, which does not require that identity verification process. That might be a little bit more comfortable. FSA hasn't necessarily provided instructions about how parents without social security numbers or ITINs should complete those questions on the paper FAFSA. So once we have specifics around that, of course, we'll send that out as well.
All right, scenario 5. Student and mom arrive to fill out the FAFSA. Student tells you that parents are divorced. Dad is now remarried and expecting a baby in a few months. Student spends most of their time with dad, but also stays at mom's house sometimes on the weekends and school breaks. Mom pays monthly child support to dad. So your 3 questions are, who will be a parent contributor on the student's FAFSA, who should be included in the family size, and what additional information do you need?
Okay, well, thank you everyone for participating again. I will now hand it over to Shannon.
Thank you. So some considerations to keep in mind. One of our first questions would be, are the students' biological or adoptive parents married to each other? If not, do they live together? And a key reason for this consideration is because if the parents are not married but are living together, consent or approval will be required from each parent contributor separately. That's also the case for parents who file their taxes as married, filing separately. Each filer or contributor would need to provide their own consent for approval. Our second consideration will be which parent provided more financial support in the last 12 months. And this is a key difference from the way that we've thought about this in the past. In the past, we really focused on where does the student live more than, if more with one parent than with the other, and that would be the parent of record on the FAFSA. Now the focus is more on financial support within the last 12 months. So the child support that mom pays to dad is counted as part of that support. So when you're in the past, when we said, well, if you're paying child support, then you are ostensibly not the parent of record, because in many cases, this isn't always the case, but that student would be living with the other parent more, perhaps. But again, no longer really a consideration. You would actually take that child support along with any other support that was provided for the student from mom. And if that's more than 50% of the student's financial support, then mom would be the parent of record or the contributor on the FAFSA. If dad provides more than 50% of the student's support and is the contributor, then he would select remarried for the marital status and include the step parent's income as well. If the step parent and the dad filed separately, then both the step parent and the dad would provide approval or consent for the DDX, or the direct data exchange of their FTI, or their federal tax information. Mom's marital status is a question to ask only if you determine that she is in fact the contributor or provides more than 50% of the student's financial support. Here's a nice little infographic to help determine who should be provided on the FAFSA as a parent contributor. You'll see, are your parents married to each other? No, but do they live together? Yes. Then both parents' information would be on the FAFSA. And again, if they're filing separately, both would provide their approval or consent. Here's an example, like I mentioned before, really the direct data exchange, or the DDX, is apparently pretty seamless. You don't need to know the address that was on your tax return when you filed your 2022 taxes. You really provide that approval and it syncs up, and the FAFSA is going to assume that your family size is equal to the amount of folks reported on your taxes in terms of your marital status and the number of dependents reported on your taxes. So in order to even see that information on the FAFSA, you do have to initially click yes, is the parent's family size different? And then you'll be able to see the assumptions that are being made on the FAFSA that are being pulled from the tax return. And then you can then select no if you need to change that information. If there's other folks in the household that maybe were not reported on the taxes as dependents, we'll get into this a little more later, then there's an option to update that information here. Going on, the family size, again, will depend on which parent is the contributor. So in this case, we've got dad and stepmom and any other or step parent and any other kids that they may have or dependents they may have. And we're not looking at mom's dependents, because if mom is not the contributor in this case. Again, the family size is transferred from the IRS based on the tax information. And here's, if you're more of a textual person, basically what I just said, you have to click yes, that the family size is different in order to even see what was filtered to the FAFSA from the taxes. And then if you see that it is actually correct, then you select no. This is very counterintuitive, because the question is kind of a negative. The question is the parent's family size different from the number? So if you say no, that means it's the same and the tax assumption was correct. So if the family size from the taxes is incorrect, you can manually update number of children or other dependents who live with the parent. That's key. And will receive more than half of their financial support from the parent between July 1st, 2024 and June 30th, 2025. One other difference is that from now on, unborn children are not included in the family size unless it is the student who, once that child is born, if they would then become an independent student based on having a child that they provide more than 50% of the financial support for. So again, other dependents must live with the parent and receive more than half of their support from the parent to be included in the family size.
Thank you for that very thorough explanation, Shannon. We appreciate it. So moving on to scenario 6. Student and mom arrive to fill out the FAFSA. Student tells you that their grandparent and uncle also live with them. Mom provides more than half of the support for grandparent. Uncle works, files his own taxes, and pays mom rent and groceries. The questions are, who should be included in the family size? What additional information do you need? And again, you'll be prompted to join a breakout group. Please do that as soon as that notification pops up. Thank you.
Shannon, I'm going to pass it on over to you now, as everyone is now back to give us the answer.
Great, thank you. So this one is mostly review, I believe, but since the grandparent does live with the mom and mom provides more than half of their support, the grandparent should be included in the family size. If the grandparent was not claimed on the mom's taxes, or if mom just isn't sure, then they can check the number calculated from the tax return of the household size, again, by clicking yes to the question, is the parent's family size different from the number of individuals claimed on their 2022 tax return? Once they click yes, they'll be able to see the number of the household size that is assumed from the taxes. And if it is correct, and it already includes the grandparent, so the mom claimed the grandparent as a dependent on their taxes, then the parent can change that answer from yes to no and just let the tax information flow through the FAFSA. Otherwise, they can manually update the number of dependents or household size to make sure that the grandparent is included in the household. Keep in mind that any other dependents that are not the parent's children must live with the parent and receive more than half of their financial support from the parent in order to be included in the family size. Now, since the uncle works, pays taxes, he pays for rent and groceries, then he's not included in the family size, even though he's living with the mom. He's not receiving more than 50% of his financial support from the mom. If he filled out a FAFSA, he would be an independent student.
All right, scenario 7, unwilling parents. So student and parent come to your workshop. Parent is friendly and supportive of the student, but it's clear that they're financially strapped. They don't trust the government and won't be providing any information for the FAFSA since they aren't able to help the student pay for college. So your questions are, can the student submit the FAFSA without parent information? What additional information do they need? How do you handle the conversation with the parent? And what will happen if the parent continues to refuse to provide their information on the FAFSA?
Okay, it looks like everyone has now joined us, so I will pass it on to you, Shannon.
Okay, thank you. So again, really critical piece. If the parent decides not to provide consent or approval and contribute to the FAFSA, contribute their information to the FAFSA, the student will not be able to submit the FAFSA, and the student will not be considered for any federal grants or subsidized loans. They will have the option to be considered for unsubsidized loans. And there's actually a new question on the FAFSA. If you say no to all of the independent questions regarding homelessness or being an independent minor, any of those things, there's a new page that says your dependency status. And it says, based on your answers, you are a dependent student. This means you must provide parent information on your FAFSA. This helps us determine your eligibility. And then it says, apply for a direct unsubsidized loan only. Of course, an applicant is likely not going to know what that means. But there's a little subheading there that says, are the student's parents unwilling to provide their information, but the student doesn't have an unusual circumstance that prevents them from contacting or obtaining their parents' information? And then they can select yes to that question, and that will allow the FAFSA to be sent to the school without requiring the parents' consent. And then the schools can also possibly help with that communication with the parent as well, really explaining kind of what, trying to encourage them to provide their consent if they're willing. We do have those conversations a lot at the school level when we need to, of course. However, so I wanted you to know kind of what that looks like, because of course that idea of an unsubsidized loan is very jargony and someone's not really going to know what they're asking about on that FAFSA. So reading that part slowly is helpful. But of course, we want to explain to the parent that providing their information for the FAFSA, providing their approval or consent, it does not at all mean that they have to contribute financially toward the cost of college. It's really the only way for a student to qualify for federal financial aid that's need-based, including grants, many scholarships, and subsidized loans and work study, and to help them just pursue or continue their education. If the parent does still refuse to consent and contribute to the FAFSA, the student really has to kind of do, I guess, what I call a gut check sometimes to determine if there are unusual circumstances. And that's kind of the official phrase now on the FAFSA that prevent the student from contacting their parents, or if contacting their parents would pose a risk to the student. So they also will have the option to say yes to that. Now, based on this particular scenario, the parent's refusal is not an unusual circumstance because there is a relationship, there is contact, and as far as we know, that's not unsafe. So the student would really have that option to request the unsubsidized loan only, instead of being forced into a position where they could not submit the FAFSA at all. Let's see, I think, really helping to understand, if we can, like to pull out a little bit of information if possible about that relationship, and to see if it's really an option for the student to say that they have an unusual circumstance would be really helpful. In the past, many of you know that if a student either couldn't provide parent information due to an unusual circumstance, or they needed to request an unsubsidized loan only, that FAFSA would be processed, it would come to the school in a status called rejected, which has always been, it's often been re-traumatizing and triggering for folks who are in a situation I might be feeling a bit rejected in that moment, and now their FAFSA status is officially rejected. That is no longer going to happen. And we'll talk a little bit more about these independent statuses, but the FAFSA will be processed assuming that the student is independent, and then the student can work with the school to figure out exactly how to move forward and which option is best. So that kind of takes the pressure off of the FAFSA preparer and really helps encourage the student to just get the FAFSA through and then talk to the school, and corrections can always be made with the support of their college or university as well. And kind of while we're talking about this and all these changes, one thing I'd like to just remind us all is that while this is wildly different for all of us, for a lot of our applicants, this is just going to be business as usual, and it's actually going to flow. It really will flow in many cases a lot more smoothly than what we're used to. So that's a real kind of positive spin on all these changes that we're trying to wrap our minds around, so we can kind of, I don't know, keep our head up in the midst of all these changes.
Thank you, Shannon. Okay, for our last scenario, parents in another country. Student moved to the US in November 2022 and is living with her brothers, both of whom have green cards. Her asylum application was approved 4 months ago. She was told they would receive her green card within 15 months. She has a social security card that says valid for work only. Her brothers pay for 100% of her living expenses. Both parents are in Afghanistan and she has contact with them, but they do not provide any financial support. The questions for this scenario are: which application will the student complete, the FAFSA or the CASFA? How should the student answer the question? At any time or on or after July 1, 2023, was the student unaccompanied and either 1, homeless, or 2, self-supporting and at risk of being homeless? And the third question is, could the student be independent on FAFSA due to unusual circumstances? What information would you need to consider this?
And with that, Shannon, I'll pass it on to you to share the response.
Great, thank you. So, of course, so you all were correct. Good job. This student will complete the FAFSA. Approved asylee status makes the student an eligible non-citizen. So she is eligible for federal aid and can use her social security number to create a studentaid.gov account. Now, if she was in a position where she had been maybe provisionally or, approved for asylum, but didn't quite have a social security number, then she should either wait to do the FAFSA until she receives it, or if she has a pending asylum application, she should submit the CASFA because she's not yet an eligible non-citizen. This is also the case for folks who are waiting on an official permanent resident status if their application is in process. So also with regard to being an unaccompanied homeless youth or at risk of homelessness, she will answer no to that question. She does have stable housing, even though she is unaccompanied. She is living with her brothers and has been. There's no indication that it's temporary or unstable. So we will say no to that question. And again, she's not self-supporting since her brothers are providing 100% of her support. So again, that unaccompanied homeless or at risk of homelessness is both unaccompanied, which she is, but then she does not answer yes to the homeless or at risk of homelessness status question. Now, since she does report having contact with her parents, one of them might be able to create a studentaid.gov account using identity verification if we assume that they do not have a social security number. They will indicate that they did not file a US tax return. They'll manually enter their financial information on the FAFSA, converting to US dollars. Now, of course, that might be tricky if someone is not living in the United States or never has, but we have received some guidance from federal student aid that even parents who have never been in the United States can still use the identity verification process. Again, even though it's a credit agency that is creating that process, it's not the same as, someone doesn't need to have a credit history in the United States in order to verify their identity. Again, once we receive more specifics on that, we will send out some information, especially when that is live. Now, since she does have asylee status, is separated from her parents, she does have the option to indicate that she's not able to contact her parents when she's presented with the unusual circumstances question, which we'll show in a moment. So again, it's really a case-by-case situation. What really is that situation with her parents? If she does say yes to one of those unusual circumstances questions, again, her FAFSA will be processed. She will be considered provisionally independent. Her FAFSA will not reject. She will be issued an SAI, or a student aid index number, to determine her eligibility for federal aid. The FAFSA will be completed as independent, and she'll just follow up with the financial aid office to provide whatever kind of documentation she might have, which again, if she doesn't have, court documentation or something like that, might be more the dependency override option, which will still be an option through the schools. Now, if her parents are in a situation where one of them can create an account and complete the FAFSA, that option would likely be the simpler and quicker path to being offered financial aid at her college or university. So here is the unusual circumstances question on the FAFSA, and lists the different qualifying aspects. They left home. So we've got abuse, neglect, abandonment, estrangement from parents. This is only biological or adoptive parents that we're considering. Been granted refugee or asylee status and are separated from their parents, or their parents are displaced in a foreign country. They've been a victim of human trafficking. They have been incarcerated, or their parents are incarcerated and contact with them would pose a risk to them. Or they've been otherwise unable to contact or locate their parents and have not been adopted. So saying yes to this question, again, will allow the FAFSA to move through without requiring a parent contributor. One other big difference, just real briefly, is that students no longer need to report money paid or received on the student's behalf. So for this case, the brothers are providing all of her support, and they're not a custodial parent, but she does not have to report that support received. So this is a big help as well. Okay, so federal student aid just released a huge announcement that we can now count on the FAFSA and the CASFA to be launched by December 31st. Obviously, I'm being a little facetious there. By statute, the FAFSA must come out by January 1st. So really, our simplified message is apply for financial aid in January. Before you start your spring term, whatever it is, while you're still on winter break, just focus on January. Schools are students will start receiving their FAFSA submission summary. That used to be the student aid report. So the SAR is now an FSS. So they fill out their FAFSA January 1st. They should get a summary of their submission by the end of January. And at that point, they'll be able to make any corrections or add additional colleges if they need to. So this is going to be a bit of a slower spring rollout. So they will be emailed that their FAFSA submission summary is ready. My understanding is that tax information is still going to be protected. Students, I don't believe they'll be able to view their parents' tax information, things like that. So this summary is a signifier that their information will be made available to schools. Colleges and universities have been notified that we will begin to receive what we call ICERs, which is the Institutional Student Information Record. It's our version of the FAFSA, no earlier than the end of January. So schools are not going to be going out with offer notices unless they're provisional, most likely for continuing students, until later in the spring than what some folks might be used to. I know DSF has come out with surveys to different colleges and universities to see if they're changing any of their deadlines as far as scholarships and financial aid priority deadlines. I know with the community college system, we're generally not doing that because we didn't really make any adjustments when the FAFSA was moved from January to October anyhow. So it's kind of business as usual, but at least for us here at the community college system, we are expecting to go out with offer notices in March or April, which is definitely later than we like. And CASPA is just going to follow suit with FAFSA.
Thank you, Shannon. We're gearing towards the Q&A part of our time, but just wanted to point out these resources that are available and will be are included in the slideshow that was linked in the chat, but will also be sent out to you after today's session with the recording. So the other thing that we wanted to offer all of you who are student facing is the opportunity to share this with families, that we are going to be hosting Facebook Lives for parents to address questions. So similarly to you learning a new application, there may be some nuances of different parent situations. We are hosting an English and a Spanish Facebook Live session in 2 weeks. And these are the flyers. We will be able to send this out as well with the follow-up materials. So we are going to have a separate English and a Spanish session just to allow for folks to be comfortable in the language that they're learning and asking questions. They can join with the link that's added. We'll be presenting a simplified version of the information that you have learned today or in any of the previous sessions that we've done. And so just the most important pieces that families should keep in mind so that they can better prepare for the launch. And mostly we're going to focus on question and answer. So they can type in any question that they may have. So please share this widely with your families, and you can reach out to me if you have any questions.
Hi, everyone. I'm Natasha Garfield with DSF, and I am going to moderate Q&A for us here in just a second. But first, just want to highlight that we do have another training coming up a week from today. That is our advanced topics in financial aid. This will be diving into additional complex situations that we have not covered today, and possibly circling back to a few of the scenarios that we've talked about today to get even more into some of the variations that families might be experiencing. So it is an in-person session, which means we have limited seats available. So the link is on your screen, or the QR code, and it'll also be in our follow-up materials if you would like to join us next week. And we are also going to be offering a CASFA training coming in January. As you know, the CASFA is modeled on the FAFSA, so they are preparing a revamp there as well. It will launch at the same time as FAFSA by the end of December. And once it's live and we can take a look at what that experience will feel like, we will be preparing a training on that as well. All right, we are now going to move into Q&A. Thank you all for submitting your questions. We really appreciate your engagement with this material. We're going to do our very best to answer all of these. Some of them we may need to circle back after today's training to provide more specific information, because obviously there is a lot that is new. So we've tried to research and find the answers to these questions, but there may be some that we need some additional time. So we're going to send those out in a Google Sheet so that you can refer back to it later. And we will also address any that we can't get to today in next week's session. So Shannon, I'm going to invite you, and also Dante and Deanna, if you all have answers to any of these and you want to join in, please just feel free to jump in. First question we have is, if the IRS transfer fails, then what happens? Is there a way to enter the information manually?
Yes. If the IRS transfer or the DDX fails, the contributor will be prompted to input their information manually.
We also have heard reassurance from federal student aid that the failure rate should be much, 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 much lower than it was with the old system, that the connection is much more of a immediate transfer, and it won't have the same barriers with the particulars of typing an address correctly or anything like that. As soon as the contributor's student aid account is verified and confirmed, that transfer process will, they will start that interface. And so once the consent is there, the information should immediately be connected, which is why they can show the family size that's being pulled from taxes. Going back to, we had a scenario in the beginning that was about a student who had an expired student visa. We have a participant asking, what about the same scenario, but a valid non-expired visitor visa? Which application would that student complete?
I'm thinking that this would be a non-eligible non-citizen, so would not complete the FAFSA, but they could have the opportunity to, they should complete the CASFA just in case. Some schools with more resources can give students who are considered international students different types of aid and scholarships based on information on the CASFA, even though, and perhaps that person could also qualify for asset status as well.
Thank you, Shannon. Next question, what will it look like when dependents are on a parent's tax return but might not live with the family, or if children live in the same household as the parent contributor but are on a different household's taxes as dependents? So really two questions there. The first one is dependents who on the tax return who don't live with the family. And an example of that might be the grandparent who was in one of our scenarios. If that grandparent is receiving financial support from the parent but doesn't live in the household, would they be included in the family size?
Well, in that case, it's very possible that the family would benefit from that if they just allowed the dependents on the taxes to roll through. I think the intent on the FAFSA is that the household size would really be folks who both live with the contributor and receive more than 50% of their support. So that would be the most accurate way to complete the FAFSA. If that wasn't checked and they just kept going with the process, then those dependents from the taxes would automatically be included in the household size. And then the second
part is if there are children who live in the parent's household, but they're on a different household's taxes.
Right, so that's the case where when the question pops up that says, is the household size different from the number of dependents on the taxes, you would say yes, and go ahead and add those other individuals to your household who, even if they're reported as dependents on someone else's taxes, but they both live with you and receive more than 50% of their financial support from you.
All right. The next question is asking for, this is not a question for you, Shannon. This is a resource question for DSF, asking for a parent-student friendly summary of the considerations for scenario 4. in multiple languages, yes, we can prepare a summary like that, and we'll add it to the virtual binder that will be shared out to everyone.
Another thing that's come up for me around this is, and I think that you all are likely in a position to potentially help with this, is identifying folks that you've maybe worked with in the past where you know that the parents were reporting all zeros as their social security numbers, and doing direct outreach to those families to say like, hey, you know, things have changed. We've got good news. We'll help you with this process, and really supporting them to create studentaid.gov accounts. And I think, you know, the paper FAFSA, I think sometimes with, I don't know that it's not each FAFSA. Oh, sorry. We can go ahead and ask the question verbally.
No, go ahead. Oh,
okay.
Yes. Thanks, Shannon. Is the paper FAFSA really any safer? It's still a federal document, easy to identify who is undocumented, and it will delay processing.
Right. So the safety component is not necessarily different. I think from one application to the other, it's equally safe in that sense that it's really authorizing the Department of Education to transfer information to schools. And like we went over in that scenario, I think that it's the identity verification process that it just alleviates for folks if they do the paper FAFSA. So some folks might not be comfortable with the electronic aspect of that or with that identity verification, so they can just do the manual signature. But I don't think that there's any difference in the safety aspect.
Thank you, Shannon. How is the total amount of financial support a student receives determined? For example, if a student lives with a divorced parent, is the rent the divorced parent pays considered as included in the student's total financial support amount?
And this question, I think we kind of covered with the other, you know, items paid on behalf of a student. So that would be no. That they would not need to report any money received or paid on the student's behalf, including rent and things like that, regardless of the custodial parent aspect of that question. So no.
Yeah, so I think just in terms of the, sorry, the question just moved out of my eyesight there. Okay. In terms of the question about how the total amount of financial support is determined, so figuring out which parent provides more than half of the financial support, I think it's really a question of who is paying for which portions of the student's living expenses. So in a situation where the student is maybe living about half the time with each parent, if the parents are divorced or separated, then it might come down to, is one of the parents paying for things like insurance? If that's the difference in, you know, who's providing which form of support, it's really going to come down to all of those expenses of daily living and the parents determining which one of them is bearing the larger portion of that. What FSA has said is that if the parents say, you know, we are really splitting all costs to support the student 50-50, then the parent who has the higher total of income and assets should be the one to contribute on the FAFSA.
Thank you. I think that was the actual question. I appreciate that.
Well, I think that both questions were in there. So yes. Okay. Question about what happens if the contributor changes the family size. So if they say, yes, my family size is different than what was included on taxes, does that cause any verification, or are there any other consequences of manually updating that number?
So this is interesting, but as financial aid administrators, we've been informed by federal student aid that verification will be 30% or a third of all applicants, and it will be random. And I think that's something that I think used to be my understanding was it was a myth, you know, like it used to be that way. And then you could tell that there were certain aspects of an application that would trigger verification. And now we're being told that it's entirely random. We will likely, as a result, see more students being selected for verification. And hopefully that's not targeting folks who are only Pell, you know, who are Pell eligible. So based on the guidance we've received, I'd have to say no, it shouldn't trigger verification, but I know that that's always a little difficult to really believe all the time. So we'll kind of have to see how that pans out.
Thank you for that, Shannon. I also saw a question asked of the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators about whether the change here, a difference in what the parent reports compared to the taxes, would automatically trigger verification. And the response there was no, it wouldn't be considered conflicting information that the college has to resolve unless there are other things that suggest that something is really off. So maybe if the number changed by, 20, or there was some really significant change or other reason to believe that there was something not quite right about what was being reported, it could be conflicting information, but otherwise it should not trigger anything.
That's a great clarification. And we know that parents often, when they're separated, they kind of trade off head of household filing status and will report a student in, different years. So it, like Natasha said, it's not necessarily conflicting information. It could be if also the FAFSA information changes drastically from one year to the next.
Thank you. Is it safe to say that the parent who claims the student on taxes will be the contributor and they and their defendants will make up the family size?
Not necessarily. Like I said, we know especially separated parents will sometimes trade off who claims a student on their taxes. So we definitely still have to kind of determine that financial support question in order to really know the answer to this question. And then whichever dependents or other household members that are receiving more than 50% of the identified contributor, they would be included in the household. So first it's really determining the contributor and then moving into the household size from there.
Thank you, Shannon. Given that the new form is supposed to go live December 31st, is there a specific way students should renew their FAFSA as of now? Is the process still the same?
So you won't be able to renew a FAFSA until the 24-25 FAFSA is live. That is also the case, like I said, for CASVA. It's also the case for creating a studentaid.gov account. So folks cannot create those accounts either until the FAFSA is live. So again, just for the simplified communication, I think focusing on January might be a little bit easier.
Shannon, what I've been seeing is that if students or parents have a social security number, they can create their studentaid.gov account now. It's just that the identity verification process for folks without SSNs won't be available until the FAFSA opens.
That's absolutely, okay. Yes. Thank you for clarifying that. Yes.
Okay. Is there a specific way the financial aid offices at schools process paper forms versus online forms for FAFSA?
No. So the FAFSA gets submitted to federal student aid, whether it's submitted electronically or through snail mail as a paper FAFSA, and then the school just receives that electronic record once it's processed by federal student aid. So the timing could be different. Obviously the mail will take longer than the electronic transfer, but other than that, that's the only difference.
This is circling back to something that we've already talked about, but just think that a lot of folks are asking about it, so it may be worth further exploration. And that is, how do you determine if a person is receiving more than half of their support from a contributor?
So often, excuse me, often it is the case that a large portion of financial support is housing. So in many cases, it may be that the parent with whom the student lives more is the one that is the primary financial support. But again, you're really looking at, like Natasha mentioned, insurance, who's paying insurance, who's paying for most of the student's expenses, including living expenses. So kind of comparing what's the amount of child support being paid or received compared to all of the expenses that are coming out from which parent. And again, like Natasha said, if it's really equal, then it is arguable that the parent that does have the most assets or financial ability to pay for a student's needs might be the one that is providing more, though it isn't always the case.
Thank you, Shannon. What if a student's permanent resident card is expired and not yet renewed? Can they still complete the FAFSA?
I believe that they would need to do the CASFA for now. I mean, they could do the FAFSA, but it would come in with a flag saying that their citizenship status was not verified. So we would not be able to process a financial aid offer until they did have a valid PR status. So we have seen that a few times where they did do the FAFSA and it was okay. It's just that they were in a bit of a holding pattern until their status was renewed.
Thank you, Shannon. Will students still be asked how much money they or their parents have in their bank accounts, including savings? Go ahead. My understanding is that students will see asset questions if they or their parents have AGI, adjusted gross income, over $60,000, and that includes the bank account questions. Is that what you understand, Shannon?
I cannot recall the specific limit, but I do know when I went through the FAFSA prototype, I was prompted to answer that question. So I think we can still expect it. However, some of those assets, including child support received, are not going to be factored into the calculation of a student's SAI or student aid index determining Pell eligibility.
Thank you. Going back to scenario number 6, which is the one where student and mom have grandfather and uncle living in the household. Question about whether we should be digging deeper to see how much the uncle contributes. For example, what if it's not sufficient enough and it's maybe $50 or $100 towards rent and $50 for groceries?
I think that if really the question is whether or not the uncle is receiving more than 50% of his support from the grandparent or the parent. And if that's the case, then we can include the uncle in the household, but we really don't need to, we're not trying to determine how much money is being contributed by the uncle as much as how much the uncle is being supported by the grandparent or the parent, sorry.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think in my breakout room, we talked about whether we needed to be investigators and really dig into the uncle's financial situation. And the intent there is that if the uncle is working and paying taxes, paying for groceries, paying for rent, and presumably paying for all of his other expenses of life, then he would not be a dependent. It's really a scenario where if mom is supporting the other people who might be living in the household, then they might be her dependent, but not if they're a self-sufficient adult who just happens to live in the same house. Even if she was not charging him any rent, I think because he is earning his own income and there's no indication that she's supporting him, he would not be considered a dependent. Okay. To clarify, I think this is important because with the changes in how we decide who is the contributor, who declares a student on taxes is somewhat irrelevant for FAFSA completion going forward.
I would
maybe
Go
ahead.
I would argue that it's actually more relevant now than it has been in the past, because the household size is going to automatically defer to who is declared on the taxes. So now we really need to, that's one reason why it's helpful to have the taxes handy. Or you can say that your household size is different, just so that you can see what it is assuming on the taxes and make a change. So yeah, it's actually more relevant now than it ever has been, at least for the initial FAFSA. And then again, you do have the opportunity to change your household size if it's different than your taxes.
Yes, thank you. And also you could change which parent is the contributor. So it could be, especially in a divorce situation, that one parent is, that the parents are alternating who claims the student as a dependent on taxes, but that may not always align with who's actually providing more than half of the student's financial support. So it's a good starting point, but it isn't always going to be the ending point for deciding the parent contributor. All right. For scenario 8, so this is the one about the student who has had her asylum application approved. Question about the language indicated on the SSN card that says for work authorization only. Is there any language to refer to address concerns about using the SSN for FAFSA if it's not related to work?
I think that the intent of having the work authorization only language in this scenario is, the short answer is no. I believe, because I think we're really just saying, like, should you be concerned that the social security number is only valid for work authorization, or if you have some indication that maybe the student has DACA status, should there be any concern about using that social security number? Or, and really, I think the intent is to say, if there is a social security number, that should be used, regardless of the type of social security number that it is.
Yes, I think it would be a different case if the student was still waiting for the asylum application to be approved. If it was still pending, then they would want to do the CASFA because they're not yet an eligible non-citizen. But once that asylum application is approved, they can use that social security number just like anyone else would, because it's a unique identifier, and that's the purpose that it's really being used for here.
Yes, yeah, so asylee status. I misspoke there.
Thank you, Shannon. If a student is granted independent status due to an unusual circumstance, will they need to provide documentation every year?
Thank you for asking this question. This is fantastic news, actually, that students do not need to re-document or re-verify their independent status, even under something that we'd call an unusual circumstance. That includes unaccompanied homeless youth, dependency overrides, and other independent minor situations will automatically roll as independent in future years. And schools will just need to verify that information only if there is conflicting information on the FAFSA. So if a student changes their response to those questions in a subsequent FAFSA, then that could trigger some documentation requests. But we're really glad to say no, they no longer have to re-verify that every year.
Yes, that is one of the really positive changes coming with FAFSA simplification. Shannon, we are just about at the end of our time for Q&A, so I'm going to ask you about 2 remaining questions. And For those of you who've submitted questions that we haven't gotten to yet, we will provide answers to those in writing. The first one is, can you give advice for students with incarcerated parents? One parent has never been in the picture and the other is in jail. Student lives with grandpa, but grandpa is not their legal guardian.
So the question on the unusual circumstance page of the FAFSA, it does indicate that you would qualify as independent due to having unusual circumstances if your parent was incarcerated and contacting them poses a safety risk. So the incarceration question isn't just kind of automatically, oh, you're incarcerated, so now you're independent. Again, it is case by case. If there's a really if there is a good relationship there where their parent is still engaged and wants to complete the studentaid.gov account and can or do a paper FAFSA, depending on what they have access to, then it's every situation might be a little bit different. So it's not automatic one way or another. It's a question we'd have to ask about, if they're comfortable getting that information from the incarcerated parent.
Thank you, Shannon. Okay, last question for now. If a sibling claimed the student on taxes instead of the parent, what are the implications as far as who is the contributor? And in this scenario, mom is still in contact with the student. It's not a situation where the student is unable to contact the parent.
Yeah, great. So as a reminder, the contributing parent is only ever going to be a biological or adoptive parent. It is never, if the person who provides the most financial support is not a biological or adoptive parent, that person is never going to be a contributor on the FAFSA, as we know things now. So the fact that a sibling claimed the student on the taxes is really irrelevant, except when the contributing parent's tax information is pulled into the FAFSA. Their dependents on their taxes are not going to match the household size. So this would be a case where they'll want to go ahead and update the household size to reflect the actual household, as opposed to the number of dependents reported on the parents' taxes.
Thank you very much, Shannon. All right, well, that is all the time that we have for questions. Dante, if you don't mind moving on to the next slide, please. I would like to give a huge thanks to Shannon, Deanna, Dante, Cindy, and all of the other folks who have helped to put this training together. Shannon, we are so grateful for your willingness to continue to share your expertise with us and to be so kind and sensitive to our students and families in answering all of these questions. So we are very grateful for all of the support that you provide to us and your partnership. For those of you who are either a DSF staff member or a member of our FAFSA Volunteer Corps, we are going to take the remaining time in this session to ask you to complete the FAFSA knowledge check that we did prior to the start of our trainings. Oops. So if you don't mind scanning that QR code or going to the link that's showing on your screen, this is just a mid-training check to make sure that folks are getting the information that you all need to be able to support students and families. If you're not a DSF staff member or FAFSA Volunteer Corps member, you are very welcome to take the assessment just to check your own understanding, or you can say goodbye to us now, and we will be sending out the recording from today's session, as well as all of the follow-up materials, hopefully by the end of the day today or possibly tomorrow. And thank you very much for joining us.